Good afternoon and welcome to the Foundation for Teaching Economics webinar, Budgets, Expenditures Are Not the Same. Today's talk will explore the sometimes confusing process of government budgets and government expenditures. A very relevant question as our government discusses additional spending as a result of COVID-19. I'm Ted Tucker, Executive Director of the Foundation, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Bill Bergman. Mr. Bergman is the Director of Research with Truth in Accounting, an organization whose mission is to compel governments to produce financial reports that are understandable, reliable, transparent, and correct. In addition to his work with Truth in Accounting, Mr. Bergman teaches finance at Loyola University in Chicago. He worked as an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago and earned his M.B.A. and M.A. in public finance from the University of Chicago. Mr. Bergman was a presenter at our November 2019 Washington, D.C. Federal Budget Deficits and Debt Policy and Practice Program, and I'm grateful for him giving today's presentation. A recording of this webinar, along with Mr. Bergman's slide deck, will be posted on the FTE website in a day or two following the conclusion of today's webinar. After his talk, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Please use the Q&A feature to submit a question, and feel free to upvote any questions that you like. Following the webinar, we ask that you complete a short evaluation of today's presentation. So Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Ted. Nice to be here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your teachers. You have a great mission at the Foundation for Teaching Economics. Again, my name is Bill Bergman. I'm the Director of Research with Truth in Accounting in Chicago. By way of background, my background included, as Ted noted, 13 years as an economist and a policy analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. I've got some stories from that experience. Immediately prior to that, I finished up an M.B.A. and other masters in public policy at Chicago. And when I graduated, actually, I financed the latter with as a TA in economics courses. So it's fun to be with economics teachers. When I finished that experience, I was invited to teach economics at the University of Chicago without a PhD. In hindsight, maybe that would have been a good thing to do. But fast forward to recent weeks when I just finished a chapter in a new book coming out about the Chicago School of Economics. My assigned topic was Paul Douglas, this fellow who was a professor of economics at Chicago and a 3-term US Senator from Illinois, and a great fiscal responsibility fellow who I'm going to talk about a little bit in my talk today. My talk is titled Government Budgets and Expenditures Are Rarely the Same. And this relates to thinking about how well do we monitor and control our governments, especially the federal government, as it spends our money. My screen is refusing to change slides. There we go. Okay. So let's get cracking. We're going to have some introductory ideas here before we get into the meat of the presentation. We're going to be talking about accounting topics and how they relate to economics and finance. I still recall my dad yelling at me to take accounting as soon as possible, and I never really did. I should have paid more attention to it. I'd encourage you to encourage your students to get interested in it sooner than later. It's the language of business, and it's in theory also the language of governments. We all have a shared stake in our public purse, and understanding it includes understanding important topics in accounting. So accounting's about words and numbers. It's there's lots of numbers, but there's also words. What do the words mean, and when do they mean what they say they mean? It's one of the things I've grown to appreciate over time is the importance of simple questions in finance and economics, and in accounting. For instance, what is cash? When you look under the hood on these simple questions, you start learning that there's some pretty crazy and important stories underneath those simple questions, including the question, what is cash? In a world where we have banks that have deposits that are sometimes at risk Cash isn't such a simple thing that we sometimes just take for granted. Accounting is about numbers. It's also about words, but it's also about symbols, like a dollar sign. What is a dollar? Do we just take a dollar for granted? What is a dollar? A very simple question with a long history. I'm going to recommend 2 articles to you to potentially share with your students. One is Edwin Vieira's monograph, What is a Dollar? And an article by Seth Lipsky titled, What is a Dollar? Similar articles taking a legal history of what was a dollar at the time of the founding of the United States and the Constitution and the founding fathers and friends, and what did they think a dollar was, and what has a dollar become since then. I mean, when we open up, the next time you go into a supermarket, look around, you see all this stuff on the shelves, and what's the one thing they all have in common? They've all got a price tag denominated in dollars. The same thing goes with financial statements. Lots of complicated line items with different words and numbers on them, but they're all denominated in dollars. Well, what is a dollar? And at the end of the day, whether or not it's become, in the words of one constitutional law scholar, Edwin Vieira, it's become a political abstraction in his bottom line analysis. And if that's true, maybe we shouldn't take a dollar for granted. I'm going to have an important point about that at the end of the presentation. Okay, if a dollar is one thing, but maybe a dollar today is different from a dollar tomorrow. And that's another topic that I believe is worthy of introducing to students. The sooner the better. And not just the fundamentals of accounting, but the fundamentals of finance and the fundamentals of present value. The sooner you get your students interested in this stuff, the better, I think, in the long run. I'm teaching now finance at Loyola, and it takes time. And one of the ways to introduce this idea about present value, we're going to be talking about government debt today, but debt is a present value of future obligations. And one of the classic old time sayings that helps to illuminate what debt is a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. There's two main things in there that make a bird in the hand worth 2 in the bush. First, it takes time to get to the bush when you could have had a bird in your hand, so you have the risk-free rate of interest in that regard. But you also have risk, because by the time you get to the bush, the birds may have flown away. And so both the time value of money and the risk of future dollars are why we discount future dollars in finance to their present values. And that's that's that fundamental equation to get to your students. I guess I recommend the sooner the better. Also, but there's a fun little story for teachers anyway, maybe not for high school students. Who wants a bird in their hand? I don't want a bird in my hand. I want something else. Let's think about this maybe differently. Well, how about a beer in the hand is worth 2 in the refrigerator? Another way to think about this. All right, in economics, we've got money. We're talking about what is a dollar. Well, let's think about money in economics. The 3 main roles we teach, that money is a medium of exchange. It solves that coincidence of wants problem. It should serve as a store of value, hopefully. And finally, the third role is the most fascinating, and I think maybe even potentially the most important economically, is the fact that the dollar serves as a unit of account. And that's how we measure stuff. Some more introductory topics before we get into the meat of the presentation. It's going to be important as we think about whether or not government budgets really adequately manage and predict expenditures. There's a difference between expenses and expenditures. And what this difference relates to is the difference between accrual basis versus cash basis accounting. There's a wonderful fellow, an international leader from New Zealand named Ian Ball at Truth in Accounting. We're going to have him as a guest on a webinar next month. Ian Ball was a leader in New Zealand's effort to modernize its accounting and budgeting processes in a way that fully developed accrual basis accounting principles for budgets. I'm going to argue that that's something that we're far away from in the United States, especially in my home state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. Finally, in thinking about budgets and the difference between budgeted expenditures and real expenditures or expenses, there's a difference between budgets and financial statements. And the simple difference can be summarized. There are words and there are deeds. Let's step back again and talk about cash. What is cash? We're going to talk about cash basis accounting. Well, is cash, what is it? And is it always really cash? Cash is two things in accounting: cash on hand, Ben Franklin's, and cash in a bank in the form of bank deposits. But we also have at that top line item on the balance sheets, we have cash and cash equivalents. Well, what if cash isn't equal to itself? How can cash equivalents even exist? Our government, however, since 1913 has developed first the Federal Reserve, and then in the early 30s, the deposit insurance systems that we still have today as a mechanism to try to stabilize what is not inherently an unrisky thing. Bank deposits, we've learned that there are things called bank panics and banking crises, and our government has developed mechanisms to try to stabilize the system. Unfortunately, the moral hazard associated with those arrangements, I'm afraid, has led to our regular prone to financial crisis financial system that should always be taken with a healthy reminder that cash isn't always cash, that we can't just take cash equivalents for granted. The other reason this is important from a public policy and government finance perspective is that these schemes that we've developed expose taxpayers to risk in the form of the possibility of bailouts. Cash, it's hard to define, but it's important, and you got to track cash. Tracking cash is important, and that's why cash basis accounting isn't necessarily bad. It's good to track cash, but in accounting and for centuries, the leaders of the accounting community have also developed something called accrual accounting, where you're actually accruing for expenses as they are incurred, and you're accruing for revenue as you earn it, even if cash isn't moving at that point in time. It's that distinction that has enabled, for instance, the state of Illinois to continue to claim balanced budgets under their own definition, even as debt accumulates on the backs of the citizens and taxpayers. And I'm afraid that's also true at the federal government level in the United States. The city of Chicago claims to, quote, balance its budget as required by state law. But if that's true, how does the city of Chicago's debt go up every year? And one answer is that, well, I asked this question: how do you claim to balance your budget every year when your accrual basis accounting statements show revenue falling short of expenses every year to the tune, at the time I asked the question a couple of years ago, of $1 billion a year? The city of Chicago was claiming to balance its budget, despite the fact that it was spending on an accrual basis more than $1 billion a year than it took in revenue on an accrual basis. I asked a member of the city council finance committee how that could take place, and his answer, he was almost proud. He said, "Well, we borrow money," and in fact, they view the possible revenue proceeds from borrowing proceeds as a form of revenue for the purpose of balanced budget. It's like you and I claiming to balance our budget by running up our credit card. It's almost an oxymoron. And whether or not we do that at the federal level is a question we're going to be exploring today. Another question we're going to talk about today is whether or not fiscal rules, for instance, a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution, can constrain government spending and government borrowing as a source of spending. It depends on how they're worded. That's the key. That's the key lesson or takeaway from this. Let's just read this provision in the state of Illinois Constitution together. The governor shall prepare and submit to the General Assembly at a time prescribed by law a state budget for the ensuing fiscal year. The budget shall set forth the estimated balance of funds available for appropriation at the beginning of the year, the estimated receipts and a plan, et cetera, for expenditures and obligations. Here's the key language. Proposed expenditures shall not exceed funds estimated to be available in the fiscal year as shown in the budget. In other words, it's not the actual expenditures, it's the proposed expenditures, and they're not allowed to exceed the funds estimated to be available, which includes borrowing proceeds as well as tax revenue. That's the wiggle room that they have to, quote, balance their budget. Well, in order to measure performance in any organization, private sector or public sector, the accounting world depends on accounting standards. Who sets this stuff? Is there just one set of accounting standards? Or in fact, there are multiple sources of different sets of accounting standards. Here are some of the sources that we have. The Financial Accounting Standards Board, that's the FASB. They create accounting standards for the private sector. The International Accounting Standards Board, which is an association of international FASBs around the world, working to try to develop international standards that are accepted internationally. You've got the GASB or the GASB, that's the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. You've got FASAB, the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board. That's for the federal government. Then there's another thing, the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. This is a relatively new organization doing valuable work, in our opinion, trying to work to develop and inspire governments to adopt more fully accrual-based accounting for their performance. And then the final source of accounting standards is the mystery guest. The mystery guest is, I'm going to ask the question of the audience, who sets the accounting standards for the Federal Reserve, do you think? The Federal Reserve banks? Anybody?
Just go ahead and put your, you can throw it in the chat too. We'll watch the chat.
Who do you think sets the accounting standards for the Federal Reserve banks?
Someone said themselves.
That's the correct answer. The Federal Reserve sets its own accounting standards and changes them when it wants to. That relates to a story a few years ago when the possibility arose that they would end up showing a negative equity position. They're not going to do that because of the accounting change that they did. Well, these accounting standards are set, and then they are, the financial statements that are prepared according to accounting standards are audited by independent auditors as a way of certifying the integrity of those statements. Those opinions that come from auditors can be either unmodified, like a clean opinion, or a modified opinion, which finds some shortfalls. You may get an adverse opinion, which is a negative opinion. That's a type of a fail. But then another type of a fail is, in some people's opinion, the worst of all, and that's a disclaimer opinion, where the auditor just looks at the books, looks at the accounting, looks at the supporting documents, and throws up their hands and says, I'm sorry, but we just can't render an opinion, any opinion on these statements. So my next trivia question for you is, which type of opinion has the U.S. government, the federal government, received on its financial statements every year since 1998? Who wants to take a guess? The issuer of United States Treasury securities.
We're getting disclaimer. One person answered disclaimer.
That's the correct answer. Thank you, person. That's the United States government has received a disclaimer opinion every year since 1998. Importantly, driven by the Defense Department, but a wide variety of other problems. That's not necessarily a sign of financial health or risk-free securities for the Treasury securities. It's something to take interest in, and as a citizen, we all share a vested stake in that public purse. Well, what do we know and when do we know it? And maybe we need to do a better job of demanding our government do a better job of accounting for itself. All right, let's think about budgets and financial reports. Budgets are a type of financial report, but what we're going to talk about is and distinguish between budgets and financial statements. Budgets are, important documents. They're planning documents, and they're forward-looking type documents. They're linked in the government to appropriations processes, which are important, accountability devices. We don't allow our government to spend willy-nilly. It has to pass a law in order to spend money through the legislature, with executive responsibility being shared for the development of budgets at the federal level as well as at state and local levels in the United States. Budgets are one thing. Financial statements are, another thing. I'm going to assert that financial statements are, they come after the period ends, not at the beginning of the period, and they give you information about the financial condition of the entity at a certain point in time in the past, as well as over a past period of time. So again, budgets are forward-looking and establish a legal basis for spending, but the financial statements are after the period ends. There are words and there are deeds, and the deeds show up in the financial statements. But when I look at the lay of the land in the United States and in the media, and both in my own home state as well as the federal government, the tendency is that budgets get the most attention by far. And the question is, why does this happen? They're important control and accountability devices, but budgets are where the action is. What do I mean by that? I'm afraid that people care more about spending other people's money than they do accounting for it. In other words, the budgets matter because people want the money out of the government. That's why I want to crash your next session with the Public Choice School of Economics speaker. That's going to be a fun show, I think, and that's a perspective that I share and I'm concerned about from the point of view of financial reporting by our governments. Our governments are and the world, the media, cares more about budgets than it does about the actual accounting for the financial performance of our governments. Here's a quote from that Paul Douglas fellow that I mentioned. From his book, I'm going to recommend this book from 1952 to everyone. His book was titled "Economy in the National Government." This is a theoretically, quote, liberal, unquote, Democratic senator, but he was a champion of fiscal responsibility. And this book was a great illustration of that type of leadership that he provided. Well, there's a section in the book that I'm going to bring and just share with you briefly here, titled "Witnesses Urge Expenditures, Not Economy." In other words, when he sits in on the budget hearings, here's his impression of what he hears from that hearing. The subcommittees of each house hold hearings on irregular appropriations bills. These are very helpful in developing information about particular expenditures and programs. But almost invariably, witnesses represent agencies defending the budget request, pressure groups demanding larger expenditures. That's just an example of the type of stuff that Douglas was writing in this book and another great book in 1952 that he wrote called Ethics in Government. This former economics professor at the University of Chicago, who became a United States senator, wrote a fabulous and impassionate book about how to instill greater ethics in our government. That's worth reading. And both of these books taken together have some wonderful material that eerily predated the fundamental contributions that came out of the Public Choice School of Economics in coming decades. Again, I recommend both of these books highly. Check them out. Here are some sections of that Economy in the National Government book within chapter 10. Quote, this impassionate, the budget must be balanced chapter. This is Public Choice School of Economics to the T. The public interest is diffused. In other words, the general common average citizen, we all have a certain stake in the public purse, but it's widely shared on a per capita basis. It's not a big number compared to the special interests that are concentrated. Another section that he wrote was titled "Left Hand Saves, Right Hand Spends." Special interests are organized on many fronts, and powerful combinations win battles and lose the war. What did he mean by that? The further result is a fine paradox. Everybody is for economy as a general principle, but no one can get his special privilege unless he consents to special privileges for others. As groups win their battle for special expenditures, they lose the more important war for general economy. Again, this is Public Choice School of Economics stuff in very eloquent language. I recommend those books to you. Here's another old schooler, Chicago economist-y guy from the public choice area, James Buchanan. This is actually an article by Jerry Templeman. You can click on that link. You'll go to that article, and it's a review article of James Buchanan's work on public debt finance, with a good description of Buchanan's concern that public debt is the way that we spend more than we tax, and buy current benefits for special interest groups with long-run consequences. Buchanan was a champion of a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution as a vehicle for constraining government from doing what it has done, and that's run up the credit card on future generations. We'll see some numbers along those lines here shortly. So if you care about the budget, that's one thing, it's important, but you should also care about this other thing that no one cares about, and that's the annual financial report of the United States government. One example of how this worked is 2 years ago anyway, the report for fiscal year 2018. It was released in late March in 2019. It ended up being delayed by the longest federal government shutdown in US history. The reason why it was delayed is because the people that were putting together the material that was needed for the report were deemed non-essential. That's how the government shutdown works. They don't shut down quote unquote essential people, but apparently the financial reporting process wasn't deemed to be important enough to be essential to be immune from the government shutdown. That was kind of scary. The report itself, however, and I was following it closely because I wrote a good article about it after it came out, was released to deafening silence. Really, there was no coverage at all. The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Washington Post. The Wall Street Journal the following day had articles about recent GDP growth, cat allergies, A-Rod, Saudi women activists, Major League Baseball's opening day, and Lyft IPO, but there was nothing in the Wall Street Journal about the annual financial report of the United States government. Along these lines, another dog that didn't bark is pretty much regularly every year on both on a bipartisan basis. The President of the United States delivers a State of the Union address as required by the United States Constitution, but the U.S. Constitution also requires a statement and account of the public money every year. The State of the Union address tends to be delivered every year in late January or early February, and it's often delivered on a bipartisan basis without the financial report of the U.S. government. And they don't even talk about the finances of the federal government after the report comes out. That's why, well, there are some people in the Senate and the House that are working to change this. And there are resolutions actually being considered in both the Senate and the House of Representatives for a fiscal State of the Union address from the U.S. Government Accountability Office. A longer story. Here are some of the examples of the financial statements that are in that financial report of the United States government that are worth, you can help teach your students about the structure of financial statements using the financial report of the U.S. government. I'll go show you where to find that thing and how it's structured here shortly. But these are some of the examples of the types of financial statements that are in there, except for one, the last bullet point, the Federal Reserve banks. They are not on the financial report of the U.S. government. The Federal Reserve argues that it's an independent entity, and its operations are not in the consolidated overall report of the U.S. government. Some people believe, including a good friend of mine and our organization, that in fact that's an unconstitutional state of affairs. The fifth bullet point there is also worth noting. We're going to take a peek at it shortly. The statements of social insurance. Those are the statements for Social Security and Medicare, which is not a pretty picture, and you're about to see that not pretty picture. Well, here's a look at, basically the theme of the presentation was supposed to be, do budgets and budgeted spending. How come it does it always equal expenditures or not? And here's one source of the difference, and it relates to the difference between cash and accrual basis accounting. The United States budget deficit is that red bar, and this is from 2015 to 2019. This is in the billions of dollars, going from $439 billion to $984 billion in the whole in 2019. However, those numbers are, as big as they are, they're swamped by the white columns. That's the net operating cost. And the important difference between the net operating cost and the US budget deficit is the budget deficit is more on a cash basis accounting, where the net operating cost is a more accurate accrual basis accounting concept that allows for, when your unfunded liabilities go up, a certain fraction of them are actually accounted for as a cost or an expense in that net operating cost number, which is in 2019 anyway, nearly $1.5 trillion negative in the whole, with attendant implications for the growth in the national debt. The next, 220 is our next puppy is going to come out, and I think people are thinking this with the COVID implications. It's going to be north of 3 trillion on the budget deficit all by itself. Is this sustainable? An important question. What else is wrong with this slide, though? I mean, let's think very simply. Anybody? What do you? Is there? What's wrong with this slide? Fundamentally, I'm going to assert that one thing that's wrong with it is that it's upside down. These things are going up, and those are negative numbers. Maybe it should look like this. Here's a reconciliation of that budget deficit to the net operating cost in the financial report of the U.S. government. You get a feel for what drives the difference between the reported budget deficit of nearly $1 trillion in 2019 and the net operating cost, which is nearly $1.5 trillion. The biggest line item explaining the difference there is the change in federal employee and veteran benefits payable number. They changed their assumptions about, for instance, mortality and ages and age that people retire and how long they live and other factors that go into. Well, if you think that the state and local governments had pension problems, unfunded pension problems, you'd be A, right, but B, the federal government is not immune from this. We're going to take a look at that number. The dollar amount is staggering on the unfunded federal employee and veteran benefits payable. It's a big number. But what's different about the federal government compared to the state and local governments on this score? Well, one thing that's very important is that the federal government can print money as opposed to the state and local governments. And that's one thing we may have to deal with, I'm afraid, in the next decade or two, the possibility that our government thinks that printing money is a solution. We'll get to that idea here in a minute. The financial report of the US government is a very long, very complicated document. However, I've learned in finance that there are things you can do that are very simple sometimes, as opposed to, you don't necessarily have to, you can step back and do some simple things. I say that in part because of experience with AIG, back in the AIG failure. I did something very simple looking at its financial statements that ended up being kind of prophetic. Well, I've done kind of the similar thing here. This is the number of times the word unsustainable appears in the financial report of the US government since 1998. It's gone from 0 up to 16 times. And the reason it's being mentioned is that the discussion within the financial report of the US government about the fundamental sustainability of our federal government's finances has been growing over time in a way that is worth paying attention. I mean, here we are, we're talking to high school economics teachers. You guys are teaching the people that are going to inherit this earth. I'm afraid the picture doesn't look so good. So maybe helping them understand what their future holds could include keeping this financial report of the US government in your tool chest for teaching economics. This is part of that sustainability question. Under current law and policy, this is the projection that they give us for the debt held by the public as a share of GDP. After 2030, it just skyrockets under current law and policy, and it skyrockets in such a way that the people that analyze this stuff say it just simply, this can't happen. It's unsustainable. The train wreck is out there somewhere, and when is it going to happen is a good question. Here's one possible part of that train wreck, and that's the condition of the Social Security system. Social Security is not on the balance sheet. The unfunded position of Social Security in our federal government is not on the federal government's balance sheet. Does anybody know why the government argues it shouldn't be on the balance sheet? Anybody out there? The government argues that the government controls the law and can change it at any time. Therefore, it's not a liability. Hold that thought for the moment. Here's a look at the actual financial statement for Social Security. The top part up here is the revenue. These are all the contributions and dedicated taxes. And this is on a present value basis, looking out the next 75 years. The total revenue for the system is at about $70 trillion on a present value basis. The total future expenditures on a present value basis is $87.2 trillion. 87 minus 70 gives you a negative hole, excuse me, of $17 trillion in the latest year. That $17 trillion hole arrives despite the fact that there's a huge positive contribution. Take a look at this after the presentation from future participants. These are young people that haven't started paying into Social Security and the unborn. In other words, Social Security for them is a huge negative, not a positive program. Well, let's think about the way that the government kept and keeps Social Security off the balance sheet as an unfunded obligation. They argue that the government controls the law and can change it at any time. This is the actual web page, the front page of a web page before they took it down anyway for the Social Security Administration a couple years ago. They set up this new website so you can go in and look at your account. And here's what it looked like. You got a young dude looking off into the future, and set yourself free, open a My Social Security account, and rest easy knowing that you're in control of your future. The question arises, how can you say that these people are in control of their future with Social Security when the government doesn't book it as a liability because it controls the law and can change it at any time? I wrote this up, and they, well, anyway, I gave a presentation at an economics conference about this, and one of the economists in the back of the room chirped up, "That's not a deceptive message. He's standing on the edge of a cliff." I told that story and wrote it up, and here's what a friend of ours did to this picture after that episode. At least they took the website down. They're not being as deceptive as they used to be. Let's look at the balance sheet for your United States government. You guys are among the 0.00001% of Americans that have ever looked now at the balance sheet of your United States government. It's got assets, it's got liabilities. A minus B gives you a net position. Total assets of about $4 trillion in 2019. Total liabilities of nearly $27 trillion. Here, look at that third line item on the liabilities. That's the federal employee and veterans benefits payable line, about $8.4 trillion worth of unfunded future pension and related retirement benefits for federal government and Army and veteran benefits that are payable on a present value basis today. Another wild number worth taking note of is that environmental and disposal liability line item, nearly $600 billion. That relates to the future cleanup costs for mainly for nuclear weapons testing dating back decades. That's been growing lately, and it's worth taking a note of. There's a long story under all of these line items, but let's just step back for the moment. And we got $4 trillion in assets, $27 trillion in liabilities. 4 minus 27 gives you a big negative hole, a net position of $23 trillion in the hole. Introducing the balance sheet, however, we get the following comforting sentences. There are, however, other significant resources available to the government that extend beyond these assets presented in these balance sheets. Those resources include stewardship, land, and heritage assets, in addition to the government's sovereign powers to tax and to set monetary policy. In other words, we don't have to worry about our government. It can take our money away and inflate the value of the dollar away. That's not comforting in my book. So I'm going to urge you here, kind of in closing, more or less, to take a real informed and excited interest in your teaching in government accounting, government financial reporting. It's a fundamental cornerstone of securing the accountability of our government to the sovereign in the United States. And that's why I get troubled by the claim that the government possesses the sovereign powers to tax and set monetary policy. That document that we're talking about, that financial report, is supposed to secure the accountability of the government to the people of the United States. The government is not our king. The sovereign is the people, and including your students. Finally, here's a quick story about Paul Douglas that I can't resist sharing from Milton and Rose Friedman's, Two Lucky People memoirs. This is Milton Friedman's memoir book. Rose remembers Douglas as an extremely colorful teacher. In the Principles of Economics course she took with him her first year at the university, he arrived in class one day with a bag of oranges to demonstrate diminishing marginal utility. He proceeded to toss oranges to the students one by one until they yelled, "No more." After this demonstration, how could anyone forget diminishing marginal utility? A fun economics story from Milton Friedman. Finally, a quick two more quick stories, and let's get into the Q&A. 2 days ago was my Aunt Judy's birthday. My Aunt Judy was my mom's twin sister, and here's a quick picture of my Aunt Judy and my mom. My mom's on your right over there on the right, back when they were little ones in the old days. Here's a picture of my mom, and that's me on her right there, back in the day. My mom, speaking of high school and high school teachers, my mom passed away in my senior year in high school, no warning, on a tennis court, a brain aneurysm. But she was a great lady, and so I'm just going to share her with you right now. And her lessons were, Bill, do your best and always be honest. So that's what I try to do. All right, nice to be with you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Great, thanks, Bill. We definitely have some questions for you. The one question that we have here is, when are the federal government financial reports released, and where can we find them?
Let's take a look at where they come out. I'll share my screen again. Is that okay?
That's fine. Go ahead.
All right. They tend to be released early in the year for the fiscal year ended in September 30 every year. The federal government's fiscal year ends at September 30. And here's the actual page. You just Google financial report of the United States government. It comes out of the Treasury Department, the Bureau of the Fiscal Service. And here it is. We'll go to the current report down here. And here's the report. The whole report in the PDF is right at that link. Then here's all the sections, including the introductory message from the Secretary of the Treasury, the results, the nation by the numbers, M.B.A. or the management discussion and analysis section. Here's an important thing to be aware of and show your students, and that's the statement of the Comptroller General of the United States, the GAO, the head of the GAO, who audits the financial statements. Let's go take a peek at that. That's where the disclaimer opinion arrives every year. And here's what it says really briefly. The certain material weaknesses and internal control over financial reporting and other limitations resulted in conditions that prevented us from expressing an opinion. That's the blunt language that's been delivered every year, that we can't, the accounting systems are so pathetic, unfortunately, for the scope and scale of the organization, that we don't have reliable financial statements. We have what we have, but
we have another question here, and this is from Mr. Pinkerton. Mr. Pinkerton is asking that you had said that the Fed gets to determine its own accounting, and he was curious where that occurs within the Federal Reserve.
that happens at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, which writes something called the Financial Accounting Manual, or FAM. The Federal Reserve banks are required to follow those principles, but the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is the independent agency in the federal government. The Federal Reserve banks are the other part of the stool, and that's more of it's not private sector by any stretch, but it's those are corporations that are owned by shareholders, the member banks, but they have to follow the accounting standards set by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in the Financial Accounting Manual. I have a related story about Federal Reserve accounting that I would like to share with you briefly. In the late 1990s, members of the Board of Governors were testifying to Congress that access to FedWire was a source of subsidy for banks with access to it. And it sure looked like a subsidy. The FedWire system moves $1 trillion a day in between the banks, and the Federal Reserve guarantees every payment. A longer story, but the fact that the members of the Board of Governors, including Chairman Greenspan, were testifying to Congress that access to FedWire was a source of subsidy was very curious in light of the fact that the Federal Reserve is required by law to price the service to fully recover all direct and indirect costs. And the question arose in my head, how can we claim to provide the service that's a subsidy at the same time we're saying it's not a subsidy in our accounting statements? I wrote a long paper about this, and I was invited to present it in Washington by Peter Wellison, who was Ronald Reagan's legal counsel in the White House. I was analyzing the accounting and the law of the cost recovery for FedWire, which moves $1 trillion a day in between the banks. And that was one of the first, the beginning of the end for me at the Fed. You can't do this. You can't question the Federal Reserve's accounting principles like this. And I think it was a good thing to do.
I like this. Here's another question. I like this one from Mr. Davison. And he's asking, did President Clinton really run a budget surplus?
That's a matter of debate. The Sheila Weinberg, the CEO and founder of Truth in Accounting, where I work, believes otherwise. That in fact, the growth in the unfunded liabilities were outstripping the reported budget deficit, and the real budget deficit was really in a deficit, not in a surplus back in back in those surplus years. I still remember at the time I was working at the Federal Reserve as an economist, and economists were writing papers about how do you conduct monetary policy in a future world that doesn't have treasury securities. That's how crazy things were. People thought that the surpluses were going to grow and actually become so important that we wouldn't have treasury debt outstanding anymore. How would the Federal Reserve conduct monetary policy and open market operations without without treasury securities? But we've learned otherwise, that that's not the world we have today.
We have another question here, actually, and this was something that I wanted to ask you as well. I think earlier in your talk, you mentioned wanting to support a balanced budget law. And so the question for Professor Leonard is, if we had a balanced budget law with real teeth in it, what would we have done about COVID relief stimulus? That's
an important question. And in fact, it relates to, even fundamentally, how would you conduct counter-cyclical, quote unquote, counter-cyclical fiscal policy in a world with a balanced budget amendment with teeth? And that's the rub. It's a very difficult thing to write, a thing with teeth. One thing that we've learned, for instance, with the gold standard, even if you believe a gold standard is a good thing, it's a gold standard until it isn't. and when push comes to shove, our government has tendencies to make the push come to shove as opposed to following the law, or change the law when it's deemed to be beneficial. There's debates behind here. I'm personally a skeptic that fiscal policy can be counter-cyclically productive. It's possible that quote unquote stimulus spending post-COVID is not necessarily all that stimulating, but I'm gonna leave that as a matter of debate. I'm not gonna debate it now.
Okay. Then I have a question. Our speaker in our last webinar made the statement that as long as interest minus growth in the economy, interest on the debt minus growth is less than zero, debt is essentially free, especially in this era of very low interest rates. I was just curious to kind of get your input or your take on that.
Well, I'm afraid I'm much more skeptical, if not concerned, that we can't take low interest rates for granted. Interest rates are low today, to be sure. However, what does the future hold? In economics and finance, I've gained more respect for the challenges we have in understanding what happened last year as opposed to predicting the future. But I don't think we can take low interest rates for granted. And part of that deals with my concern about the federal government's financial position. I'm afraid that it's not necessarily going to inspire international investment success in the future like it has in the past. And if people, there's a quote about bankruptcy that's worthy of respecting on this score. That, how did you go bankrupt? The question goes, and the answer was very slowly, and then all of a sudden. And that's how, when crowd psychology turns against you, sometimes it can go very quickly. And I'm afraid we can't rely on low long-term interest rates forever.
Oh, we've got here's a good question here from, again, from Mr. Pinkerton. He says, what country is a good example of solid economic accounting?
Well, we're getting more and more appreciation, and I encourage you to learn about the success in New Zealand for their accounting systems and the leadership they have provided internationally for developing a solid accrual basis accounting process that is not only accrual basis on the financial statements, but getting the budgeting processes to account for things on an accrual basis. New Zealand and the work of Ian Ball, that's one recommendation I have for you.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. And this question says, if we look at expenditure reports, isn't that sort of like worrying about the horse being gone after we left the barn door open? agencies, branches of government, others have input to the budget, but how would we get the horse back in after the expenditures have been made?
Well, what I'm going to assert that it's important to know what happened in order to prepare for the future, and that's where the expenditures are still. You can't just ignore the expenditures. But I think the question is absolutely right. In a sense, you're just this is after the fact. We need to take a more responsible role in our own governments as they develop policy, as it builds on itself, and be much more proactive in allowing our governments to do what they do to us. Unfortunately, I live in Chicago. I'm a little bit jaded. The way in which the city and the state of Illinois have run up the debt on the taxpayers is something that doesn't speak well, not only for the government, but for the citizens and taxpayers that allowed this condition to take place. So I applaud the question. And I think the questioner is the type of citizen that is a good citizen leader that we need more of, not less of.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bergman. Thank you for your time and for everyone else participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, please take a moment to give us your feedback. There's a follow-up survey to the webinar. And as I said before, there will be a recording as well as Mr. Bergman's slides will be posted on the FTE website in a day or two from now. Then I would just ask you to please tune in again on December 9th as FTE continues to explore issues associated with federal government's debt deficits. When Dr. Jamie Lemke, Senior Research Fellow at the Marcatus Center at George Mason University, will discuss public choice theory and how it helps explain how people make decisions about spending public monies. So anyways, thank you everybody for your time, and stay safe and healthy, and have a great afternoon or evening wherever you are. Thank you.